Okay. I might get started with the first of the intros, and then hopefully we'll get more people joining in as we continue. So hello and welcome to everybody that has joined us today. My name is Rhiannon Boyd and I'm the CEO of ACTS. And I'd like to welcome you all today to what is the first of 3 sessions jointly presented by SDSN Australia, New Zealand Pacific, ACTS and Prime Australia, New Zealand chapter. And they'll be covering mainstreaming education for the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd like to start the session off today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we respectively meet from and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who join with us in the meeting today. I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people as part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation representing an alliance of 5 language groups who are the traditional owners of the lands that cover Melbourne, traditionally known as Narn, and much of central Victoria. So I'd like to invite all of our audience members to use the chat to say hello, but also to join us in acknowledging the country that you're joining from today. So that's my introduction to start with. It's my absolute pleasure now to pass over to my colleague, the amazing Tal Keston, who is the powerhouse, not just behind this series, but the ongoing work between our organisations to accelerate the SDGs throughout the sector. So over to you, Tal, to introduce today's session.
Thank you, Rhi. Gosh. Well, hello, everyone. And I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging as well. So as Rhi said, I'm the Network Manager for SDSN Australia, New Zealand Pacific, based at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And my pleasure today on behalf of the organising team and our advisory group to welcome you to this session, as well as to the broader initiative around mainstreaming education for the SDGs. We're really excited to see how many people are online today and how many people have registered. And as Rhi said, we'd really love to hear where you're joining us from. So we're here today really because we believe that one of the most important contributions a higher education institution can make to achieving the SDGs is to provide all students with the knowledge, skills and mindsets to address the complex sustainable development challenges represented by the SDGs through whichever pathway they choose in their lives. But mainstreaming this kind of agenda in higher education is a huge and complex endeavour for an institution. So really to help support and create momentum towards this in our region, SDSN ACTS and PRME have been collaborating since 2021 on a number of events where we particularly wanted to provide a forum for the whole community across disciplines and at really any level in an institution to get a sense of who's doing what across our region, to share examples of inspiring initiatives, and to raise our collective understanding of what needs to be done and how, including challenges, opportunities, and learnings. So we're really thrilled to bring you the next instalment in this initiative with 3 sessions this November. Today is the first one, another one next week on integrating education for the SDGs into disciplinary settings, and a 3rd session in a couple of weeks' time, looking at the types of programs and approaches higher education institutions can take. But today we're kicking off with one of the really crucial elements in any discussion on mainstreaming, which is change leadership. And what does change leadership for education for the SDGs look like in a higher education context? And how do we inspire, motivate, and strengthen emerging and potential leaders working towards this? So to do this, we're really excited today to be joined by 4 experts with really decades of collective experience in implementing ESD and EFS approaches in higher education, who will share lessons and insights they've gained over the years with us. So we'll shortly be joined by Belinda Gibbons from the University of Wollongong, by Ross McDonald from Otago Polytechnic, and Marcia McKenzie from the University of Melbourne. But to start us off and to facilitate the remainder of the session, I'm very excited to also introduce Jeff Scott, who's Emeritus Professor of Higher Education and Sustainability at Western Sydney University. And from 2004 to 2012 was the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Quality and Executive Director of Sustainability at Western Sydney University, where he established, as I think many of you know, the UN-endorsed Regional Centre for Expertise in Education for Sustainable Development, amongst many other accomplishments. He's widely published author of reports and articles on change leadership, sustainability, social entrepreneurship, and lots of other things, and is currently working with universities and colleges in Europe, UK, East Asia, Australia, and New Zealand on how best to embed the SDGs in the curriculum. So Jeff has also been part of the advisory team for this initiative and has been a huge help, and thank you. And I really can't think of anyone who's really better placed to kick us off today. In particular, he has leadership for sustainability has been one of his speciality areas, and his study of successful change leaders of education for sustainable development, called Turnaround Leadership for Sustainability in Higher Education, is widely used around the world. And he's going to start us off by sharing the lessons from this study today, and then we'll take the discussion from there with the other panelists. So before I turn over to Jeff, though, really encourage everyone to both ask questions through the Q&A facility and to share any reflections, experiences, links in the chat. We again really love to hear from you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to you, Jeff. And as you requested, I will share your 12 points document.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Tal, and hello to everybody. Essentially, what I'm going to do is probably in about 15 minutes or so, just quickly run through some of the key points that we've picked up from our studies of some successful change leaders around the world over the last 15 to 20 years. But lessons which we've then applied to our own practice. So it's a summary, if you like, of both things. Now, Tal, are you able to share your screen and get those points up for me? Tal? Yep.
Apologies, Ree, can you allow me to share my screen?
Yep. So what?
Sorry, people, I've had a few issues with the Zoom that I'm just working through. So bear with me 1 second. All of our settings have been disabled.
So look, while we're bringing that up, guys, essentially, really what I'm going to be talking about now is really there's two integrating themes that I've discovered from all this research that we've been doing with successful change leaders in sustainability around the world for the last, as I said, 15 or 20 years. The first is good ideas with no ideas on how to implement them are wasted ideas. Thanks very much, Ree and Tal, for getting those up. And the second one is change doesn't happen, but it must be led, but deftly. And when I talk about change being led, it's a myth that it's a mystic senior leader that actually makes change work. The key arbiters of change in this area, like in every area in universities and higher education and schools and vet colleges, is the local program leaders are the final arbiters of whether change happens. So they are a key ingredient. If they don't choose to engage with a change effort because they see it as relevant and feasible and desirable, they won't engage their staff to learn how to do it. And so you'll get change on paper, but not in practice. So those two key lessons, good ideas with no ideas on how to implement them are wasted ideas. And secondly, change doesn't just happen, it must be led. And as you can see now on the screen there, you can see that first dot point that's sitting up the top there. And I'll just ask Tal to move me gradually through these in a moment. The first one is really, what I'm about to give you is 12 lessons that we applied at Western Sydney University from this research, which has worked out reasonably well in that, not that rankings meet an enormous amount, but certainly it's gratifying, I think, for the university and the staff and the senior executive and the staff and the students for Western Sydney University to be first in the world this year on the Times Higher Education SDG impact rankings. So it's sort of a series of lessons that has led to a bit of an outcome. So I hope that's useful. So the integrating themes for these lessons is always listen, then link, then leverage, and then lead, always in that order. So an effective change leader, whether you're a local program leader or whether you're a Pro Vice Chancellor or a Deputy Vice Chancellor or Vice Chancellor, is you listen, link, leverage, and lead. And so you'll see those four sort of dimensions of that integrating theme will run through these lessons. So I'm now just going to quickly go through each of these. And this is what we did at Western Sydney University when I was starting off our whole journey on actually embedding sustainability as a core focus for the university back when we started around 2008. So I think maybe Jen Dolan's on with us today. Jen can actually then say whether or not I'm telling the truth about this or not. So the first thing we did is we did a stock take to start to identify what everyone was already doing. In those days, it wasn't the SDGs, but these days it is. And in fact, the university has just relaunched a way of gathering in what everyone's doing. There's a website that Western Sydney University set up there under that first dot point called United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where everyone reports what they're doing in their teaching, their learning, their research, their community engagement, and their actual campus projects, so that we can link and leverage what everyone's doing into a more unified picture. That also is a motivator, because you'll always start by acknowledging what people are doing before you start to build on it. Not only that, you'll identify all sorts of things people are doing that you can actually use as models for others to look at. That's the first lesson. The second is you need to have a why bother case. People are not just going to spontaneously engage in change just for the sake of it. Now, in doing that, a good way to do that is to say that what we're trying to do is morally decent. The SDGs actually do deal, I think, with issues of substance to everybody in our society these days. And secondly, if you've actually done a stock take beyond your university, you can tell people what other folks are doing. And that's a way of motivating engagement. So that's the second one, why bother? The third one, you need to engage the senior executive. And that can be done both intrinsically by talking about the moral purpose and the mission of the place. And Western Sydney University has had a long commitment to actually giving a chance to those who are first in their family at university to get a decent higher education degree and optimise their life chances. But there's extrinsic motivators too. We know from the UNESCO study in 2018 that 95% of students want to see more attention to sustainability in the curriculum, and 25% say they hadn't even heard of the SDGs at their university. So there's ways of actually optimising recruitment, which is a way of actually engaging the senior executive. The fourth lesson, and I'm just going through these quickly, but you can see the sense of what I'm getting at. The fourth lesson is you need to get a senior leader to actually be responsible. But you need to build up a network of local folks who can actually look at unique ways to actually address the sustainability agenda. And so what we set up at Western Sydney University was a network of associate deans and heads of programs who then worked to me as the Pro Vice Chancellor and Executive Director of Sustainability through a process of what we call steered engagement, which is where you know where the fleet wants to go, but each member of the fleet will work out uniquely sensible ways in which to address it relevantly and feasibly. So that's lesson 4. Tal, if we can just move on to the next little lot, please. So the next key lesson is we must keep in mind what engages staff with change. And they'll always be asking, just like you're asking of me now, is what I'm saying relevant? Is it desirable? Is it clear? And most importantly, is what I'm actually arguing about, is that ever going to be feasible to actually put into practice? So feasibility always interacts with relevance, desirability, and clarity. And often this is where places fall down. They actually come up with a brave, brand new plan that looks absolutely fantastic, but actually nobody sees it as relevant, desirable, clear, and feasible, particularly those who are the final arbiters. Lesson number 6 is we can use both intrinsic motivators like moral purpose that I've mentioned and extrinsic ones. So, setting up, in fact, acknowledgement for what people are doing around the sustainability agenda, not just individually, but as groups. And in doing that, we need to recognise there's a profound difference between change, which is just something becoming different, and progress, which, and this is critical, is a value judgment by the individual that this is desirable. So that notion of distinguishing in the minds of those who are change leaders, that those who you want to engage will be making judgments about the relevance, feasibility and clarity and so on, but they'll be doing it around their own values. So if you don't listen, link and leverage, you won't know what the values are. And then lesson number 7 is change is not an event, but a complex learning and unlearning process for everybody, because change is learning. Like, change is actually learning the bits you don't know how to do. If that's the case, then every change leader, whether it's a central one or a local one, is in fact a teacher. Therefore, we should be applying the same lessons that we know that engage students with learning with our staff. Things like just in time, just for me, access to successful ways to make the change work, and things like sort of giving immediate feedback to people, linking and leveraging people as mentors to help them work out peer support. All of those things we know that work for our students, we should be doing with our staff. That's lesson 7. Lesson 8 is start small and build on your successes. So it's always far more effective to go ready, fire, aim than ready, aim, 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 have a subcommittee, aim, bring in an external reviewer, aim, and then see you next year. Ready means we want to have a go at something. And this is what we did at Western Sydney University. Let's try this under controlled conditions. That's fire. Work out what works by doing it. And then you only after that do you actually work out what your aim is. So you go ready, fire, aim. And in doing it that way, you actually build up, in fact, an understanding of what works in practice. You have a small team that has tried it under controlled conditions. They become mentors for others who want to try that change. So that's lesson 8. Lesson 9, when you're taking decisions, focus on consensus around the data, not around the table. And we know that the meetings often are places to which good ideas can be taken and quietly strangled, but also meetings are often places where people just shoot, but they don't actually look at what the data's saying. They talk about their personal ideas. That's to be wary of. Therefore, lesson 10, we need to meet less, but meet better. There's a lot of meetings that take place that actually go nowhere, where people sit there basically with their smartphone trying to do their emails or their texts or looking up TikTok or whatever it is and not paying attention. So when we meet, it has to be for a reason. Lesson 11, keep in mind that how you act when things go wrong, you personally, is actually a model for others. We're only tested, our capability is only tested when things go wrong, not when things are running smoothly. How you behave then, the extent to which you can remain calm, the extent to which you can listen to others, the extent to which you can tolerate ambiguity, the extent to which you can diagnose what's really going on, the extent to which you can work out whether this is really a big problem or are you just catastrophizing a minor problem. All of these things through your behaviours when things go wrong are models for those around you. And that's how culture is built. That's how a change-capable culture is built. And if you're interested in the top 12 capabilities of the 188 successful sustainability leaders that were involved in our study a decade ago, that reference there is available for you. You can just download it on the web. 9 of the top 12 capabilities are about personal interpersonal capabilities. And finally, and last but not least, always listen to resistors. It's a courteous thing to do, but it's also a very important way in which you can actually identify just what you're up against in terms of resistance for change, but also listening to a resistor can sometimes win them over. If you acknowledge their concern, you're more likely to have someone in favour of you than simply categorising them as a blocker. So that's it, colleagues. That's the 12 lessons for what it's worth. The integrating themes, remember, are listen, link, leverage and lead. And the key lessons are good ideas with no ideas on how to implement them are wasted ideas, and change doesn't just happen but must be led. So that's I started teaching in Macquarie Uni in 1970, so I've been teaching 52 years. These, I think, are certainly the recurring lessons that I tried as best I could manage to apply. And it's certainly what Jen Dolan, myself and colleagues at Western Sydney University have tried to actually consistently put into practice there in our sustainability agenda. So I hope that's of help to everyone. And Tal, so what we can now do, I think, if that's okay, is we can actually now bring on first of all Belinda. I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Belinda Gibbons. She's Deputy Associate Dean of Education at the Sydney Business School at the University of Wollongong. And what we decided as the panel before we met, guys, was each of the panel members would, first of all, say if there's anything in terms of the 12 lessons I've just outlined took their fancy or resonated with their experience, they just briefly mention it. And then secondly, if there are other additional tips and lessons on effective change management, they would highlight those. And we've set ourselves about 7 minutes each for each panel member in terms of time. So over to you, Belinda.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. I would just firstly like to acknowledge that the absolutely beautiful land on which I'm joining you from today is Aboriginal country, and I'm joining you from Dharawal country on the beautiful south coast of Australia. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I have definitely not been teaching for 52 years. I can only imagine the change or not change that you've seen over this time. I guess I'm just going to run through my tips, and I'll mention the ones that align with Jeff. My first tip is know your why, and Jeff mentioned that developing a why bother case, and my experience is really similar. We need to know why we are embedding the SDGs in education and ask ourselves why this framework. It's not like we don't teach social, environmental and economic impact at our universities. We do. As Australia, as higher education academics, it's our job to ensure our students are ready to tackle a world of complex challenges. But how we do this depends on our own disciplinary standards, accreditation bodies and internal uni strategies. So why apply a global framework such as the SDGs is quite a tricky question. And it's tricky, the tricky part is that the SDGs are not a thing. They're not a piece of tech or a product or service. They're a holistic framework through which we link our teaching and learning and our research and our operational activities too. They don't replace what we do. They aren't something else that we necessarily add into our curriculum, but more the foundational base. And there are many frameworks and foundations and bases out there, and each discipline uses multiple. So as a change leader, you really need to come back to why do you want to use this framework, the SDG framework? You know, is it for ranking? Is it so that the university has a common language that cuts across curricula? Whatever it is, to know your why. And so for me, for the last 7 years at my university, I've done a lot of why discovery and lots of why explaining. And for me to know your why, you have to know what the SDGs are, and not just that they are goals, but what is underneath within the targets and the indicators. And this kind of leads to my second tip or lesson, which is educate within before you can embed. So as change makers, you have to help your internal colleagues understand how to make the link from their discipline to the SDG framework. So I present on the SDGs within my university probably 3 to 4 times a month. This started about 7 years ago when we kicked off on our SDG journey, and I presented to all professional teams first: marketing, HR, admin, recruitment, and then gradually build up to, you know, that discussion occurring across faculties and schools. So I can find myself in maths, medicine, or nutrition classrooms, helping colleagues and students understand their link with the goals. So sometimes I can see students look at me querying why a business professor is in their nutrition class, and that is a good question. I don't know a lot about nutrition, but I do know a lot about the SDG framework, and I use the framework to talk about nutrition to students who just think they usually fit in the good health and well-being goal, and talking them through, and the academic in that classroom, to understand how important their future food policy work is on education, equality, cities, you know, land, peace. But it really does come back to our colleagues have to understand what we're asking them to embed before we can expect them to embed. My third tip links with Jeff's senior executive engagement, but I wanted to focus on the who and say to choose your champions wisely. I chose an influential ally 1 level down from the senior executive, and I asked for 30 minutes of their time. So you must remember that when, I guess, a lot of our journey started today, it was quite some time ago. So this was back in 2014, and the SDGs weren't necessarily talked a lot about in universities. So this ally got me a 15-minute presentation in front of our executive team during one of their strategy sessions. And at that point, the research executive started really engaging and asking a lot more questions. So the research executive started ensuring that the global goals were in all research grant applications, HDR applications, training, research strategy days. And I found, which was quite interesting, once it kicked off in the research space, it then started entering the university operationally and then moved into education. So for us, education has been kind of last, which is quite interesting. But again, that's kind of, I guess, 7 years on. For change leaders, I guess my fourth tip is crucial, and I feel that your institution has to walk the talk. So we can't ask others to embed or teach a holistic global framework like the SDGs without putting our words into action. So we can't teach climate action and net zero if our institution is not committed to net zero. We can't teach gender equity or reduced inequalities without understanding these ratios within our own institutions. We can't be wanting the SDGs embedded, but be seen at a coffee shop with a disposable cup, or hold an event that does not consider waste or FOGO bins. So I think this is really important as change leaders. We need to live and embody the sustainable development goals. And if this can't happen, across your university as a whole, if that's too big a leap, then, need to think about it happening in your faculty or your school or your team. But it's crucial to get staff buy-in. They have to feel that their institution is also living what they're asking them to teach. And finally, my last tip is very much, I think Jeff talked about having a stock take, and stock takes are really popular conversations across universities, but they're massive projects. I guess for me, a way you could try and tighten that a little bit is if you just try and reach outside your discipline and get to know other faculties. There is a lot happening in this space. If you can reach out to your business schools, business schools are all over this discussion, and they have to be. It's in their accreditation requirements, and they report on the SDGs as part of their PRME membership. And so across Australia and New Zealand, most business schools are PRME members. And so if you reach out to your business schools, you'll definitely have colleagues there who can help you. Reach out to your geography schools. They're another discipline that embeds the goals by the very nature of who they are. Reach out to your engineering schools. Engineering Australia ensures our engineers are learning about the goals. Organise an event together, organise an event with another university. If you have no time to wait for your university executive, if they're not on board by now in 2022, they may not be coming on board. And so I think we are all change leaders. And yeah, I hope the lessons that I've kind of talked about today help you action in some way. Thanks, Jeff. Back to you. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's fantastic. So what we'll do, with no further ado, we'll just move over now, and I'll just ask Dr. Ross McDonald, who's Director of Sustainability at Otago Polytechnic, to join us. And Ross, if you could just give us your tips and reactions, that would be wonderful.
Yes, kia ora all. My name is Ross McDonald. I am calling in from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from the Roi of Ngāi Tahu, who are the dominant tribe down in this part of the country. Thank you both for such interesting and enlightening perspective in terms of working in this space for many years. I find the points that you are making resonate very strongly with me. What I'll do is just add a little bit of perspective from my own experience, and particularly my current position, which is trying to embed sustainability across a huge range of diverse programs as the Polytechnic I work in New Zealand, a amalgamates into a national organization combining 10 polytechnics and 16 training organizations. So we've got everything from hairdressing and automotive students to architects and business students and design students, all of which we're trying to cover with a sustainability perspective. In terms of particular things that I think it is good for anybody leading in this space to be cognizant of and to think through, there are a number of things I would just add to what's already been put on the table. The first one I would say is not to wait for the perfect plan before you start acting. It's one of the things I see very commonly is when large new initiatives and particularly transformative initiatives are tabled, that it's fairly common for us to sit around, particularly in large committees, and try and devise the perfect plan before we take the first step. I think that often leads us to delay, and that much of the best learning in how to do something comes when you start doing it. I'm a firm believer that we learn as we do, and that practice is the way to perfection. So I think starting doing things and then learning as you go is an extremely important aspect of it. That doesn't mean to go off recklessly with no plan or roadmap, but to constantly push beyond the level of your certainties, because that's where the creative ground really is. So getting going without the perfect plan, I would certainly advocate. A second consideration, I think, is that as one begins to look across an organization to see what is currently being done, one of the important aspects of that, particularly in the early stages of introducing sustainability, is to identify the parts of the enterprise where the chances of success are highest. So in my current situation, for example, I've deliberately looked for faculties who are ready to move, able to move and keen to move in terms of coming up with creative ways of embedding sustainability into the curriculum. If you start with the best, you've got a good chance of finding best practice. And if you can do that, you then develop models which can be disseminated and shared with others. If, on the other hand, you start with the hardest nuts to crack, then it's unlikely that you'll develop best practice starting at that end of the spectrum. So I firmly advocate starting small and in a select way, and where you can find the greatest success. A third consideration I think is really important for anybody who is a leader in this space is to ensure that the teams you work with are highly functional teams. This relates to Jeff's point about meeting less but meeting better. I've been in many situations where people are pooled into teams without any form of sort of prior vetting. And by that, I don't mean any formal process. I mean just an informal level of having talked to a wide range of people and have a rough assessment of whether people are going to be good members of a good functioning focused group. Some people tend towards arrogance. Some people tend towards high levels of hair-splitting specificity. Some people tend to go off on endless tangents. If you can talk to people before you form a team, you can select the people who are most likely to stay on topic and drive it towards positive outcomes. And it's very important when you have teams that people get along personally. So I think putting effort into how you structure your teams goes a long way in terms of effectiveness and efficiencies moving forward. Another thing I think we should bear in mind is that the changes we are seeking, if they're to be resilient and valuable, are always going to be voluntary changes. So we really do have to lead people and encourage people forward and avoid the temptation to be dictatorial or to overly wag our fingers in the sense of thou shalt do this. Those systems never last if they're based purely on compliance. We have to get the buy-in that others were speaking to and lead positive change by building upon a willingness that is there, and then we will unleash creativity and so forth. And the final thing, which is on a slightly different tangent, is the importance of self-care. I think for those of us who work in sustainability, if we keep close to the literature, especially at this time of year when a COP meeting is happening, we can't help but confront a number of increasingly desperate reports about the state of the world around us. I think when we work in this space, it's important for us to maintain a healthy attitude towards that, to surround ourselves by people who can distract us in some ways from that, but allow us to keep an overall balanced perspective on it, because no one wants a doom and gloom lecture from people. So it's important that we look after ourselves, because it is very trying terrain, and terrain that it's very easy to burn out on. So I think with a large tip of the hat to those who went before and an agreement with what they have to say, that's what I would chip in as a few extra considerations. Kia ora, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross. That's fantastic. And as you can see, guys, already I think we're getting some recurring themes coming through here very nicely. And what I'd like to do is now pass over to Marcy McKenzie, who's Professor of Global Studies and International Education at the University of Melbourne. And in fact, Marcy and myself discovered that work that I was doing in Canada, she comes from Saskatchewan. Actually, I think what the Canadians have been doing also has some very interesting resonance for us as well. So over to you, Marcia.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. So I am calling in from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis this evening, where it's dark here, which is in Saskatoon. And I'll be back in Melbourne later in the week. And so I'm speaking from my role in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, as well as the interdisciplinary Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative at the University of Melbourne, where I've just started working in the last year and a half. And so I'm going to speak to these points based on about, well, a decade or so of research looking at sustainability in higher education in a Canadian study with the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, where we looked at all 220 accredited Canadian post-secondary institutions, as well as a more recent project, the MEIS project, Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education project, which has a higher education component, where we've just released for COP a slate of 50 country profiles of what different countries are doing, including in the areas of climate and higher education. We have 9 new indicators, including one on higher ed, and there's case studies and so on, and a range of different partners on that, such as the International Association of Universities and SDSN's SDG Academy and so on. So kind of speaking from that, as well as just point people to that if that's of interest. So a lot of what Jeff and other speakers have said resonates with what we found in our research as well. And I wanted to speak to the points about intrinsic and extrinsic motivators for leaders, as well as how to engage resistors. And so we know from engaging in climate and sustainability more broadly that emotions are really an important factor in denial and inaction, and whether that's because people don't believe in these issues, climate change or other issues, or it's just too difficult to think about. How do you kind of face things, as we were just hearing about with the last speaker? And so this applies to higher education faculty and leaders as well. And so what we know from the literature on this, how do you deal with that is really important to engage the values and priorities and terminologies of different subgroups, whether that's of different disciplinary areas, different cultural groups, or other groups across campus. So I think this is an interesting to think about in terms of, those situations where there aren't already pre-existing champions in leadership to take this up, and maybe your, staff or someone that doesn't have the power, but how can you tap into those kind of emotions and motivators that are going to connect for leaders? And I think others have spoken about this a little bit already in terms of, one of the ways that sometimes we're able to connect is through rankings, for example, because that ties into things like student recruitment, funding priorities, and prestige in ways that, things that people care about who maybe aren't as tuned into sustainability itself. However, I just, and this gets into my sort of second point around rankings and assessment and I think that's a potentially really useful tool in advancing sustainability in higher education, but there's also a danger there. And I think it's important to be aware of that. I know when we started doing our Canadian research in 2012, it was prior to the SDGs. And so, one of the things we found was that a lot of places people would take up sustainability, but they would, separate out the three pieces of social, environmental, and financial, and they, tick off if they were doing one or the other and say, okay, we're doing sustainability, right? But really nothing would change because everything we do has something to do with, say, social economy or environment. And so I think there's the same danger with the SDGs that suddenly we potentially have a 17-legged stool where they're not connected, and things like the Times Higher Ed rankings enable us to tick off the ones that we're already doing well, and we don't necessarily have to change anything. So I think, there's a lot of power in the SDGs and a lot of potential, but also how do we ensure that we're moving across all the SDGs in ways that don't compromise each other. And so we're really making advancements in sustainability and climate action overall. And we have found that assessments that are more specific, perhaps like the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed, or HEI, they have their STARS sustainability tracking assessment system, which really enables stock taking across a lot of different areas. And this gets to my third point of the value of a whole institution approach, which HEI uses and other folks use to really think about different domains. So overall governance, as well as what's happening in the curriculum as a second domain, as well as what's happening in research, as well as what's happening in operations and facilities, and then also community engagement. So sort of a 5-domain approach to sustainability in higher ed institutions. And in what we found looking at institutions across Canada is that there's often gaps there. So a lot of what's done historically in this area earlier on was in the operations and facilities side of things, and that didn't travel across the domains. So, for example, when we analyzed strategic plans of universities in Canada, we found that about 18% didn't address sustainability at all, and then 40% had what could be called, using Stephen Sterling's categorizations, of an accommodative response. So, just in a few domains and quite shallow, and then you move up with, say, 16 with a more reformative sort of 3 to 5 domains, and 26 having more progressive responses, so depth in most domains. But then we found that none had more transformative approaches in which sustainability was fully integrated in a holistic way across the different domains in ways that supports ambitious actions such as decarbonization of universities. So just one framing that helps us go dig a little deeper, I think. The fourth point I wanted to make was just the importance of having leadership on climate specifically. This is one of the SDGs, but it's a really urgent one. And as already mentioned, this is a COP meeting happening right now in Egypt, and we're really out of time. So just that I think there's got to be action on that SDG rapidly. And when the Canadian research we did, now it's a few years old now, but fewer than half of institutions in Canada had climate specific policy at a cross-institutional level. And then the fifth and final point I wanted to make was just on the importance of higher ed institutions engaging further with Indigenous knowledge in relation to sustainability, and to consider these not as parallel priorities, which is what happens in a lot of places. I know that was the case at the University, or is the case at the University of Saskatchewan, but they're really intertwined. They can really support each other and need to, be considered together. And this relates to the framing that we take. So there's a lot of power behind the SDGs that can be really useful to leverage things, but also how do we engage with local framings and local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge to make sure that we're engaging the most, ways that fit for local contexts. So I will end there. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's excellent. So just before we move over to Tal, just giving us an update on anything that's been coming in on the chat, I just wanted to just follow up on a few points that the three panel members have made, amongst the many. One of them is the fact that the SDGs interact, and that's part of the problem in actually universities and colleges engaging with them is that they still tend to operate baronially. And if you look at the way in which research is rewarded, there's not a lot of money and acknowledgement for transdisciplinary research compared to research by particular disciplines. So that notion of the SDGs interacting was seen with COVID. If you look at what happened with pretty well every one of the SDGs actually played a role in how we might have better managed COVID. You know, whether it's crowded living conditions leading to spread, whether it's poverty, whether it's education and people not knowing, whether it's dirty water. If you look across those whole 17 SDGs, including the SDG 17, they need to work together around the wicked problems that we actually face in our society. And one of the problems in terms of the work I'm doing around the world on the SDGs in the curriculum, we need to have capstones that actually capture that wicked nature of what life is actually about by looking at the SDGs in combination. So that's one theme which I think is important for us as we're looking at our agendas as local leaders or central leaders to have in mind. The second one I think was just been raised, you know, is the campus itself is actually can be a model for what you might do around social, cultural, economic and environmental sustainability in terms of research, but also in terms of education. And, you know, that whole Spohn idea of people act their way into new ways of thinking, they don't think their way into new ways of acting. So that's a theme I think that a few of the panelists have come up with, you know, that we're walking the talk. We are models to people. We are models not just in terms of sustainability, but how to behave when things go wrong. And so people pick that up. And the final one, I think, is you hit it, that turnaround leadership for sustainability research we did. Those capabilities, that capability framework there can actually be used by all of us to self-assess when we've actually been trying to actually make a project work. If it hasn't been working out, sometimes it's difficult to diagnose what might have gone wrong, and taking the top 12 capabilities from those 188 successful change leaders in the area is one humble way in which we can actually, in a sense, learn from experience when it's happened. And that's the problem at the moment, is often a lot of people, it's a bit like Dear Diary, still depressed, I don't know why. You need a mechanism that enables you to, in fact, diagnose how to learn from experience, particularly when things don't go well. So that's just a few overall points amongst the many. I think that you can see, guys, that amongst the four of us, I think there's a lot of overlap with the sorts of key lessons that we've been talking about. Now, Tal, maybe if I can pass to you to see what's been going on in the chat.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, that's been really amazing. I have learned so much, and but there's already quite a few questions, and again, encouraging everyone in the audience to post any others. Should I read them all out for you, Jeff, and then you can facilitate the discussion?
I think what might be good is if we just take a couple at a time, and then I'll just see, we've now got all the panel up, so people can just, if they want to respond, if my colleagues on the panel just would like to respond to any question as it comes up, just pop your hand up and I'll just deal it to you. So just give us a couple to start with, Tal. And,
sure. Okay, well, one that came through was how important is it to get leadership at or support from the Vice-Chancellor or very high level of leadership in terms of making change. And another one I'll pick out is, how do you actually do transformative change? So I think a lot of the things that we've been discussing around kind of setting the process up and really building it carefully can take a lot of time, but we are getting to the point where things are getting urgent. So how do we create this transformative change? So that's just a little question.
Okay, colleagues, anyone want to respond to either the VC question or the transformative change one?
I can pick up on the transformative change thing. It seems to me that we are often blocked by systems which we are unaware of as being constraining. Because when we think of transformation, we often think of content, but we don't think of the containers and the processes that we put things in. So, for example, in Educating for Sustainability, we've talked about how many of the capabilities or capacities underlying acting sustainably are co-involved. They're difficult to separate from one another. They sort of overlap and are part of a holistic framework. Often when we move towards assurance of learning processes, where we look at learning outcomes and then map a large change onto those specifics, we can tend to reduce things down to a fractious, poor copy of the original intention. We create boxes and then we tick those boxes off. I believe that to be transformative, we need to think transformatively about the systems that we employ to further the agenda that we're working with. So at the moment, we, for example, are working on different ways of visually representing the type of capacity building that we are involved with and avoiding putting things in boxes. Because as soon as you put them in boxes, you separate concepts off from each other and treat them as if they are independent and discrete, when in fact they work in a much more holistic manner. So I think the challenges around transformation are quite profound, because we have to look at the systems we operate in and change those systems to fit the requirements of a real education and sustainability. I think too often the tail can wag the dog in that sense. So we are working with reforming the assurance of learning process in order that it provides a better fit to the creative, innovative type of solutions that we're trying to generate.
Any other comments on that? Yes, Marcia.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted to bring students into the conversation as well as change agents and the role that they can play and do play. So whether that's at, within a particular faculty or unit and different specific initiatives, or more broadly, such as the spread of the fossil fuel divestment movement across campuses around the world and the role of students in leading that. So just a brief comment, but just to really foreground, likewise, faculty and academic staff and professional staff. But in particular, we've seen students have really taken a role in leadership. So it's not always top down, but a lot of times it's when you get that groundswell from students and community that then you see the leadership of the institution stepping up on things as well. So,
Belinda, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd probably just I think the two questions are actually quite linked. And I think we have to come back to what is it that you actually need approval from the VC for? What is it that you want to do that you feel you need VC approval for? I think it comes back to, what is it that you want to do, and go and do it. We're not asking for, $1 million, or maybe you are, and then that's a different path for you. But some of the actions the tips that we're kind of talking about today don't require $1 million, that we're not necessarily talking about big funding to start these changes. They're conversations, they're relationships with people, they're collaborations for action. I think that's an interesting question as to what level you are or where you are in this journey as to what approvals you need. And I think for transformation, we need to come back to, we talk about transformation a lot, and what's the definition of transformation? To transform means you totally do something in a completely different way. So what we're kind of talking about here today, we're not transforming, we're still higher education, we're still education institutions. We want to improve the way we do things, and I think Ross's assurance of learning is a great approach. I would also probably hit those big areas like course review processes. If a course review process says you have to think about sustainable development as part of every course review, then through policy changes that those key things will be looked at. That's when you're really, not that you want to mandate, but that's when you're really getting to across that whole curriculum.
Yeah, it's That's good. So, yeah, and in terms of the VC one, you know, I think it's handy to have the Vice Chancellor on side, and to do that, one has to know the different motivators of different people at different levels in the system. And there are extrinsic motivators for VCs like publicity and image and all of those things. And the SDG, the impact ratings, certainly have engaged many VCs. I've got quite a large number of universities now suddenly interested in how we can actually start to, in inverted commas, transform ourselves, which is really how do we get the right criteria and evidence going in to get our rankings up. So, you know, there's both extrinsic and intrinsic motivators, and certainly the Vice Chancellor at Western Sydney University, Barney Glover, is seized of the agenda now, well and truly seized of it, and has endorsed, you know, the stock take we're currently doing. It comes from Barney, you know, so that sort of helps because it sets up the direction for the university. That's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of transformative change, I just wanted to pick up on what a couple of you have said, and most recently Belinda. I got a national senior teaching fellowship from the government a few years ago to look at, are we developing graduates for the last 50 years or the next 50 years? And that produced a project called the Flip Correct Project, which currently has 19,000 users around the world. When they have to do a curriculum review, they're using what's in that whole system to actually, in a sense, transform to develop graduates who are work ready plus, not just work ready for today, but work ready plus for an uncertain future. And the dimensions of being work ready plus are being sustainability literate, change implementation savvy, inventive, and clear on your values on where you stand on the tacit assumptions driving the 21st century agenda. Things like growth is good for everyone, consumption's happiness, ICT is always the answer, and globalization is just fantastic. So that Flip Correct thing is being taken, and when people have to review their courses, they're using the whole guidance that's in that, written by the 3,700 learning and teaching leaders who co-created it. Fellow travellers again, you know what the lesson I was saying? Using it when they have to look at transforming the curriculum for something that's more than just work ready for today. And that leads them into developing capstones on, like social enterprise capstones focused on the SDGs, for example, is one thing that a lot of people are now doing around the world. So it's picking up really on both what Ross and Belinda are saying. You take what people have to do and you give them at that moment when they have to do it guidance that actually steers them in a better direction, in our view, a better direction. So that's two questions. The VC question, I think, handy, and certainly I think we should all be collectively working on how to actually get folks to look at that Work Ready Plus agenda as part of curriculum review. Okay, Tal, back to you again. Any further questions?
Yes, indeed there are. Firstly, one from you, Ross, wanting to know more about the transforming the assurance of learning process, and kind of related to that, additional questions around, I guess it's around the motivators and opportunities to create change, and whether compliance is something that you can use, or as Ross was talking about, the voluntary change. So kind of what processes or means can you use to try and create change? I guess building on that.
Right. I guess in terms of the assurance of learning question, and that's a very tricky one. In many ways, it's where the rubber hits the road, because I think one of the challenges we have is one of translation, essentially, of being able to translate broad human capacities, for want of a better word, into what is bureaucratically measurable. And they are quite different languages sometimes. I think in terms of doing that, we have a real challenge on our hands, because it is a pushback against a modern creep of bureaucratization, which is really a creeping, in many ways, distrust of what teachers do on the front line. I think in organizations, the further we get away from the coal face, the more insecure people become about what's happening at the coal face. And so there are greater and greater calls for people to document in detail the efforts that they are making and their success. Part of the reason why we want to flip that over and change that quite radically is to shine a spotlight on what people are doing and can be doing, and to replace a sort of sense of professional trust at the bottom of the hierarchy, so that when we initiate change, it's initiated from the bottom up and tailored, therefore, to the people who actually have to put things into practice. It is going to be an interesting discussion in terms of how we eventually create our alternative means of assurance. But that's all for the arguing. And in many cases, I think the traditional approach, just because it becomes habitual, often isn't underpinned by a great deal of thoughtfulness. So it is amenable to being challenged. And I think if we are to transform our educational systems in the short window we have, then we need to fight some of those structural battles creatively and well. And just a quick comment on compulsion. I think at a certain point, compulsion may become required for outliers, particularly if it's instances of people undermining a larger message. I've certainly been in organizations where people are climate change deniers and make a point of that in their courses. I think anything that undermines us ought to be brought into line quite vigorously and strongly, but understanding, of course, everybody's right to their own opinions, but it comes down to facts at a certain point. For those who don't wish to engage and are somewhat lackluster in their enthusiasm, I think there's only so much traction to be built by whipping them. And I think it's much better to build a general collective movement in the opposite direction, so that people in that position find themselves increasingly out of line with others. And then, as a function of wanting to be a member of the larger group, I think they often change their ways when they realize they're in a small minority.
Yeah. Marcia or Belinda, any further comments on that? No. Okay, just one additional comment then on that. I think the issue of how do you engage resistors, I think, is, remember I made that last point, point 12, you know, there is a nuance in how you do that. You know, there's the everyone's doing it in another way, and I now feel like I'm isolated strategy that Ross has just mentioned. Another one is actually listening to resistors. Like when I was going, I always knew when I was chairing boards, I always know the people who are going to be a slight problem. So what I would do is talk to them individually in advance, have them rant and rave at me, and I'd be listening for something positive in what they said. And so what I would then do in the meeting is I would say, now, Jeff's just raised a very interesting point with me, and I'd talk about the positive point. Because there's actually an issue of people, if you are a resistor, you actually feel yourself a bit left out of it all. There's an issue of actually trying to enable people to feel that they are a bit more of it than they thought they were. And that's what we do with students who are problematic in the classroom. You know, you try to pick up positive points and build on that. You don't actually just start beating them around with a cane. So there's certainly a series of capacities for nuance around good change leaders who are actually able to manage things when go wrong. And often when things go wrong, it's actually a problem that's of a person that actually is triggering it. So I think there's a lot more room for us to actually start sharing around cunning plans about how we actually manage moments when they go wrong, how we manage ourselves, which is Marcia's point, you know, about self-care, how we manage ourselves and not wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning thinking I'm a total failure, but also how we manage others who are, if you like, problematic. So Tal, back to you for any further queries or observations from colleagues.
Thank you. Can I just check that no one else wanted to add anything to those last points?
No, they didn't. I was looking at them. They
Marcia, I think
she knows I turned on my.
They looked back at me and they said, "Move on, baby."
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I sort of want to find ways to make things more compulsory. I know. We tried at the University of Saskatchewan, for example, to bring something into the ethics process with, you know, ethics applications when you're proposing research, say to be considering the scope 3 emissions of your research and the ethical implications of that. And So, you know, I think I don't think we should say a blanket no, but how can we be more creative where it might be appropriate to bring in some measures that can help bring this to the fore for everyone. So I don't have any easy answers to that yet, but keep thinking on it.
Belinda, you had a point.
Sorry, just a fire alarm in my place. Let me just see if I can shut my door, and that might be better. Good Lord. I was just going to add, I think to, you know, our discussion today is on sustainable development. And if we look at our curricula and from a teaching academic perspective, if I look at all the things that I'm being asked to put in my curriculum every month, this is just one of them. You know, it's a really important one. I feel it with all my heart. But I've also been asked to put in will, tech. There's about 10 that I go, okay, I need to make sure that these are in my curriculum. And so I think, yeah, are they all mandatory? So I think, yeah, there's just it's a very fine line. It's a difficult conversation that to have with academics. And there's certain aspects of it, and I think we need to go, where does it best fit? When, you know, every subject can't have all these things in it. Where does it best fit? And therefore maybe the compliance comes in that discussion. As you mentioned capstones, Jeff, maybe third year has to have, you know, this, and first year has to have climate literacy, you know, like I think we need to start thinking about it that way, maybe.
Yep, that's good. Okay, I think we can move on into some other queries or observations, questions, Carl?
Yes, and just to just say that, Belinda, the next few sessions might explore some of these as well. And we have a session in a couple of weeks that will actually think about the different ways that institutions can approach it, whether it's in the kind of interdisciplinary curriculum, co-curricular activities, degrees, all those kinds of things, which I think is a really good question. Like, how do you balance, and when is the right time to bring things in? And kind of related to this, we have a question on how do you talk to different disciplines about this meaningfully? Is there one approach that you can take, or do you have to be kind of tailor your approach? I probably should read the question more, so make sure I'm getting it quite right. So what are the panel's experiences and recommendations in making sustainability meaningful to different disciplines across universities? Do you recommend a consistent communication approach, or one that communicates differently with engineering versus humanities versus health, etc.?
Any bids? Belinda?
I'll have first stab. I guess for me, throughout my institution, I really need to talk to the discipline in their language. So I use the SDG wheel, and I look at whoever I am meeting with, whoever I'm talking with, and I look at the wheel through their lens. And at a very high level, obviously, you know, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a nurse, but if I'm going to talk with them, then I quickly look at, you know, some big broad areas within nursing, and I go, okay, this is essential for, you know, this is how nursing implicates with poverty. This is how nursing implicates with sustainable cities. And then usually when I meet with them, we go through the wheel through their lens, and then just to give them a base, a bit of a foundation, because it's really, I've found it's just so difficult for people to see the link between their view of their world and then that bigger implication. So that's how I do it.
Marcy or Ross?
It's an excellent question. And I like the comments that were made previously about how we have to think very carefully about where and how we intervene. And it might be different at a first year and a third year level, for example. One of the approaches that we are finding really useful is that rather than look at the SDGs as 17 specific goals, what we're doing is we're looking at the sort of underside of that and the guidelines that UNESCO put out for educators who wish to basically build capacity for people who want to act on any of those sustainable development goals. And UNESCO broke it down into a simple framework. It's around things like being able to think in longer term contexts, being able to think in terms of systems, working with values, being able to collaborate, etc. What those capacities do is they bring a real focus to how educational initiatives can be designed. And they often point towards things like dilemmas and case studies and project-based learning, particularly, which would tie into that sort of capstone idea. Looking at those capacities allows us to have a common language when we introduce ourselves and work with different faculties, because they can see how building up collective projects, for example, can weave around their existing content without having to add another separate box into the curriculum that they have to cover. As one of my colleagues put it well recently, she said, "Oh no, not another framework." And that idea that we're just imposing something else. So I think in terms of capabilities and a simple list of capabilities, it provides a fairly universal language. But I think it's also essential that we are all on the same page in terms of the larger context, and particularly vis-a-vis climate change. I think it is remiss of us all in this day and age if we allow students to graduate from our institutions without being literate around the dynamics of the biggest force that is going to be acting on their lives in years to come. So I think if we present a common framework and understanding of the big pressures we face and have some sort of rubric of basic common capacities that we can work towards building, then the specifics can be worked out with different faculties. But I think there needs to be a common perception around that we are actually all trying to move on a common set of problems.
Marcia, anything to add?
Sure, I can add in. I'd say some of both. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments earlier, the importance of framing sustainability and climate issues in terms of the values and priorities of different communities or groups, and with different disciplines being, one of those possible groupings. So for sure, finding the connection points that people can find it meaningful, as well as all the other points that have just been made in terms of fitting it in to the curriculum and so on. So yeah, some diversity there in terms of how it's approached by discipline, but I think also the mention of the UNESCO's work on education for the SDGs makes me think too of the holistic framework that UNESCO has been working with in terms of recognizing that when we're learning about sustainability, it can't just be facts and cognitive knowledge about sustainability, that really doesn't enable people or motivate people to change or to be part of change or push for change. So really, we also need to engage with the psychosocial or social emotional aspects, as I was talking about earlier, so that you can overcome that denial or grief or, overwhelmed sense of hopelessness, etc. And a way to do that is through action, which is the third component, or kind of a behavioral aspect, so that you have all three of those kind of cognitive, social, emotional, and behavior action components working together. So I think, for example, that's one rubric heuristic that can be useful, that could apply across disciplines for thinking about how to engage students in sustainability topics and issues.
Yeah, that's good. So how to talk to different disciplines. One of the strategies that we've been using around the world, which seems to be working okay, is you actually take that notion that what people do like is to see what fellow travellers further down the same path have actually done that's working. So you're probably all well aware of the Enactus projects, And that just has 3,000 projects related to the SDGs, which are actually undertaken by transdisciplinary teams of students. So there's an interesting way, back to their talk about transformation, by showing that all these students are actually doing these projects both within and beyond their own countries around the SDGs. You've actually got a way of engaging, talking with different disciplines by, in a sense, sort of simply showing what others are doing, not telling them what they should do. That's the first point. The second point comes back to what we were saying earlier, is if you do a stock take first, you often can find that people are doing all sorts of things within the institution that once you illuminate it, other people get triggers and say, I didn't know that's what it was about at all. So rather than trying to tell people how to engage with the SDGs, it's actually starting with folks identifying what they're doing and sharing what the fellow travellers elsewhere are doing, and allowing people room to come in by actually having a senior leader and some local people working with them that they can then go to, or having a site like the Western Sydney University one where you can record what you're doing around the SDGs. So that whole issue of talking to different disciplines is really that listen, link, leverage and lead lesson. You know, it's actually starting with listening and linking and leveraging rather than trying to lead from the outset. So that's just some lessons we've learned anyway that seem to have worked okay in a few contexts. Okay, Tal, any other ones? We've got about 14 minutes left, I think, for our session today.
Yes. Okay, well, another question that has come up, and I think it was triggered by Ross's comment about choosing who's on your team. But the question was actually, like, how do we actually develop capacities in people to be good at being part of teams? And it's actually something I'm interested in more generally is, well, who can be a leader in terms of making these kinds of changes happen in higher education institutions? And are they born or are they developed? And if they can be developed, how do we help people, how do we empower them to be those change leaders?
Good. Colleagues, bids from the floor? Who'd like to start off? Belinda, got any points you'd like to make?
I think anyone can be a leader in this space. I think climate affects everyone. All these challenges they affect everyone. So I feel as academics, if we're not researching or teaching in areas that don't align with these, then we probably have to step back and go, what's our impact, in the world? We're here to help create knowledge and to help solve these challenges. So I feel at any level within a higher education institution, we can take initiative to lead in this space. We need it possibly comes down to encouragement and ability and confidence, I guess, if that's not something that we've necessarily done before. We held a whole of institution global climate change. We've done it for many years, but for this year there was no limit on who could be on the organising committee for Global Climate Change Week. It was just a call out. If you want to join, please join. And when you join, think about the event that you want to hold, and you then own that event. What is it that you want to do? And so we just had, hundreds of events across the institution. And yeah, it was beautiful just to see different levels of people, coming together. So but it's maybe it's the environment that we have to set that enables the team to work.
Yeah, that's good. Marcia? Yeah. You're on mute, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that because I mean, on one level, yes, I think, leadership can come from anyone, and things can grow and spread, and as I mentioned, say student-led actions are so important. But on the other hand, I'm just thinking of, I think also people get kind of jaded and burnt out. And I know I've had experiences myself and, seeing colleagues where there can be committees set up and processes and it's consultative and you put so much time and energy. And then what comes out the other end in terms of a sustainability policy or some different initiative is just so disappointing because it kind of went into behind closed doors with people that weren't on the committees but are VPs of this, that, or the other, and what comes out the end is just lost all its teeth. And so yeah, I guess it's not really an answer, but just a reflection on yes, we can all be leaders in some capacities, and you never know what those things will lead to. But on the other hand, I think, we need to hold our actual paid leadership accountable to, be taking action and not be delaying and not be sort of hiding behind other priorities. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Ross, what about your perspective on that one?
Yeah, no, really interesting. I kind of feel that I was interested in what you were saying, Marcia, about kind of social and emotional strengths. And in terms of leadership in this space, given that sustainability is often quite a sort of complex area to address because emotions and values are wrapped all around it. I tend to find that folks with a strong feminine side, primarily women in this space, are much more adept in many ways than men are, because they're able to just naturally pick up and deal with those kind of emotional conversations. I think in terms of a lot of my male colleagues and people I've worked with in the past, we could learn a lot by tapping into a bit more understanding of our own emotional cycles and recognizing how that plays itself out in complex interactions, because we're always involved in human relationships when we're involved with teams. For me, in terms of getting people who are good and functional in teams, I think the most important thing is to have a very clear sense of what the tasks are that a team is charged with delivering on. So a really clear agenda being set, and then people being held account in terms of performing. And I mean that in terms of a light touch, because my experience would suggest to me that if you give a competent person a complex task to do and the freedom to do it, and therefore take the credit for having accomplished it, people generally tend to rise to the occasion. And as long as the task is clear enough and they're allowed to bring themselves and their own input to it, I find that it can be a very strong way of making people rise to the best of their capabilities. We all want to perform well, and we all want to do our jobs well. And I think as leaders, one of the best things we can do is clear the road so that people can do well. So at the moment, for example, on a couple of the working groups I've deliberately got very young people on there, and partly because a youth voice is essential, but also because I want these folks to realize how good they are, because it put them in a situation where they often feel quite imposed upon or kind of intimidated. But as long as they're given good tasks and can rise to the occasion, I find that people generally do. So I'd strongly encourage a sort of faith in people's abilities, and then give them the opportunity to prove you right.
Yeah, it's so that whole issue of personal and interpersonal capabilities, is a key issue in actually making change work. It's not just knowing a lot; it's actually the things that this recurring theme that's been coming up all the time today. How do you manage yourself when things go wrong? How do you model to others how to behave when things go wrong? Is just as important as the actual content of what's going on. Just wanted to make one other final point before I hand back to Tal again. When we're looking at the climate crisis, it's really so important. It's back to the point you were all making about transdisciplinary and transform, like it all goes together, you know, it's social, cultural, economic and environmental that goes together. And that's the wicked nature of this agenda. You know, you're not going to get people to change climate if you don't look at the nature of the social dimensions and the cultural dimensions of why people do actually behave the way they do. And, you know, that's the challenge of the whole situation too, because that itself is about people changing their values. And that's not done through brute logic. And that's why education has such a crucial role, in my view, you know, that work ready plus dimensions I mentioned earlier, about a more explicit focus actually on what are the tacit assumptions you are taking with you when you're going around in the society. Have you at least thought about them rather than leaving them completely tacit? So, you know, I think there is a bit of a moral purpose in higher education that tends to get lost if you're just looking at actually training people in skills and knowledge. And I think that's something going forward that really, I think this whole issue of the sustainable development agenda actually really needs to be highlighting, I think, as part of as it were, the new university. So Tal, back to you. We've only got 4 minutes left, so maybe that's almost taken us to the end of our session, really, hasn't it?
Yes, I am afraid so. I know there's been a couple more questions, but we might share them with you later if you want to try and tackle them. Is there anything else any panelists would like to leave our audience with before we head off? Any final tips that, no? Okay.
Just one thing,
Jeff?
those points that I made, and I'm not sure whether other folks have written them down, but I'm more than happy for those points that you put up on the screen earlier to be circulated to everyone, just as a bit of an aid memoir. And I think if other folks have done the same thing and you're happy to share them, you know, we can spread it around, and from that we might actually produce a better consolidated picture to share with others.
Yes, I definitely, firstly, your 12 points are already on the website and we can share the link for that. And I think all the other additions have been really, really useful. And to me, they all really resonated a lot. And so it would be great to capture that maybe as a session summary. But really, I wanted to say a huge, huge thank you for sharing your experience in this area, because I think it takes years to develop this kind of experience, and to have the benefit of people who've been working in this area for a long time is really invaluable. And I think people forget that SDGs seem quite new, but people have been working on education for sustainability, education for sustainable development for a long time, and there's a lot of experience out there that we can build on and should be building on. So it's really great that you've come to help us learn from what you've been working on for a long time. So firstly, thank you again for all of you. And to finish off, I just want to encourage everyone to join us next week, where we'll be doing a session really delving a bit more into some of the things that we've talked about today, about how do you really incorporate this kind of agenda into disciplinary settings. You know, what are the knowledge, skills and mindsets that students actually need, and how do you build that into courses and units? So it should be a really interesting session with lots of different examples from different disciplines. So please join us for that. And otherwise, thank you to the speakers and to the organisers, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Fantastic. Take care. Bye.